We can do some.
Oh yeah, here we go. We're ready to go. Hi everyone, thanks for joining in. I'm happy to have Gabriel Bergmoser joining us. And also Karina's joined me again today. So for those who don't know, Karina Kilmore is one of our associated authors of Global Girls Online Book Club and the debut author of Where the Truth Lies. Gabe, for those who don't know, is based in Melbourne. He's an author and playwright. He won the prestigious Sir Peter Ustinov Television Scriptwriting Award in 2015 and was nominated for the 2017 Kenneth Branagh Award for New Drama Writing and went on to win several awards at the 2017 VDL One Act Play Festival circuit. And in 2016, his first young adult novel, Boone Shepherd, was shortlisted for the Readings Young Adult Prize. His first novel for adults was The Haunted in 2020 and is a bestseller, and a film adaptation of The Haunted is currently being developed in a joint production between Stampede Ventures and Vertigo Entertainment in Los Angeles. And his latest book is The Inheritance. Hopefully my copy's showing all right there. And just want to mention to anyone watching that if you ask a question, if you've got a question for Gabe, just put it in comments and I'll read it out and you'll have a chance to win a copy of The Inheritance, thanks to HarperCollins. So thanks so much for joining us, Gabe.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just wondered if you wanted to start off by telling us a little bit about The Inheritance.
So The Inheritance is I guess the best way to put it is that it's a standalone sequel to my book, The Hunted, which came out last year. It follows on the story of the main character from The Hunted, or the character who ultimately emerged as the main character in The Hunted, Maggie. But I deliberately wrote it so that it could very much be its own thing. And there aren't very many references to the first book. It kind of exists in its own space. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a bit of a left turn in terms of genre. So The Hunted lived very much in the vein of like Wolf Creek or Wake in Fright, kind of, that outback horror thriller type sphere. Whereas with The Inheritance, I was going a lot more for something akin to like a neo-noir John Wick set in Melbourne type story, where this character, this like, really scrappy survivor who's been on the run for years, but can't help herself from getting into trouble, basically does exactly that. But in stepping in and trying to help out a situation that she sees going south, she ends up kind of making it worse, and which brings her into a pretty brutal confrontation with the past that she's been running from the whole time. So if you've read The Hunted, a lot of, I guess, the questions and the mysteries that surrounded Maggie in that book, they get answered this time around. This is the book where you really find out who she is and where she's come from and what's driving her. Whereas if you haven't read The Hunted, I think it still works just fine. And basically it's the story about a girl with a particular proclivity for violence and a particular burning need to involve herself in troublesome situations, kind of having to confront why that might be and what brought her there, with plenty of the violence and troublesome situations still spread throughout the story to, keep it fun for people.
And as you said, if you haven't read The Hunted before, I know a lot of people ask this. I read The Inheritance without reading The Hunted and still enjoyed it and didn't feel like I was missing out on anything or anything like that. So just want to let people know that.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, because I've always been very keenly aware of the fact that because of the tradition that The Hunted existed in really embracing that outback horror style, it was never going to be for everyone. It's a very particular type of genre, and there are people who absolutely love that kind of thing. I mean, I'm one of them. I obviously wrote the book, but then there are plenty of people who look at it and go, it's too gruesome, it's too violent, it's too full on, and that's totally fair enough. It's not for everyone. And while The Inheritance definitely is still genre and it's still pulp and it's still action packed, I think The Inheritance is probably like I had a friend the other night who said that she hadn't read The Inheritance because she couldn't read The Hunted because she got too scared. And I was like, I think you'll be fine with The Inheritance. The Inheritance isn't a horror book at all. It was a very conscious kind of move away from that. And so, I think if the horror of The Hunted wasn't your thing, then The Inheritance might be a bit sort of more palatable, maybe.
Yeah. And on that as well, I have to say I'm not really I try to steer clear of horror myself and didn't feel like The Inheritance was anything like the horror that I try to steer clear of.
I'm interested, Gabe, would you think that, I love The Hunted, absolutely adored it. And almost The Inheritance is like a prequel to The Hunted. Is that how you wrote it or not really?
No, yeah, it's so interesting because quite a few people have asked me that question, and I think there are a lot of people who assume it is a prequel just because, Maggie is so much more fleshed out in this book. Like in The Hunted, she's very much this kind of external, almost Clint Eastwood man with no name, lone gunslinger character who kind of wanders into the situation, and you don't fully get a handle on who she is until about halfway through the book. Like she's very much in the background in the first half of the book, and that was kind of by design because a big part of the hook of The Hunted is, and sorry to anybody who's read The Hunted who's flinching at my use of the word hook, but part of the hook of The Hunted, the figurative hook, not the literal hook, was the question of who is this girl? Who is she? Where's she coming from? What's she running from? And it's not until the back half of the book where you really get that question answered. So this time around, The Inheritance is a sequel. It's set after The Hunted. And I do think that psychologically for Maggie, what she went through in The Hunted does inform her motives in The Inheritance. Like basically there was a choice she made in The Hunted that was quite a selfish choice and people got hurt quite badly because of it. And I think that part of, I guess, the subtext of her journey in this book, even though it's not spelt out that directly, and that's partly by design just to make sure that it was very user-friendly to anybody who hadn't read The Hunted. But part of the subtext is she's trying to make penance for what she's done. She's trying to kind of make up for this bad mistake she made in The Hunted. But that said, obviously, The Inheritance also delves into her past the way The Hunted didn't. And my brother actually called me the other day, having just finished it, and he was like, I think this one should have been first. He was like, I think this book should have been first. And he goes, I think that people should read The Inheritance before they read The Hunted. And I don't actually have that strong an opinion on it either way. I mean, it's not like there was, I wish I could say that there was some grand design at play here, or that I had some, epic plan for like, I'm going to set it up in The Hunted, then delve into The Inheritance. But that really wasn't the case. It was honestly just like this almost quite mercenary conversation with my agent about, all right, we finished The Hunted, we've sold The Hunted, where do we go next? And I had like a pile of different ideas about where to take Maggie next. And this was the one that we thought was the most interesting because we thought after The Hunted, people are going to want those answers. But I honestly think that you could just read them the other way around, and it might be better in some ways. I think there's kind of benefits to doing it both ways, but technically it's a sequel, but it is also her origin story as well in some ways.
Yeah. I'm with you, bro.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
I reckon you could definitely read it either way. I've read it traditionally. I read The Hunted and then Inheritance, but absolutely you could read Inheritance and then The Hunted. Yeah, definitely. It works either way. Yeah.
No, awesome. And that's kind of what I really was hoping for, because I made a big mistake when I wrote my first YA books several years ago, the Bird Shepherd books. And that was that I guess I was a very green writer, and I had this trilogy planned. I had this idea that it was going to be this trilogy, and I would like set up plot points in book one that would pay off in book three. And, readers would like, they tear through and they'd get to that point in book three and they'd be like, oh my God, he's planned it all from the start. And I had this like big meticulous plan, and I ended the first book on this big glaring cliffhanger that was like, it ended on this huge twist cliffhanger, and then had this big brazen thing there being like, Boone Shepherd will return in title of next book. And then the first book didn't sell that well. And suddenly you're like, oh, okay, now I'm going to look like a complete idiot. We ended up getting a second one and a third one. Bridget was published by a very small print publisher, and the nomination for the Readings Prize meant that the first one sold enough to justify another one. But it was this huge confronting lesson where it was like, okay, so every young writer wants to write a series, right? Every writer wants to do the Harry Potter or the Game of Thrones thing and have this epic story where, you know, you can show off your impeccable long-term planning skills. But the reality is, if the first book doesn't sell, then you might not get a second one. So I was really adamant that with both The Hunted and The Inheritance, if they were the first time you picked up a Maggie book or the last time you picked up a Maggie book, they would be completely satisfying in their own right, you know? Like, and so even with The Inheritance, I didn't want to end it on some huge glaring cliffhanger that, you know, might then be frustrated if it ended up doing terribly. I wanted to make sure that it would be a satisfying conclusion for her story, but also a satisfying introduction for her story. And I really kind of worked to make sure that both books were satisfying standalones that didn't rely on another story to be enriched or to be understood, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you maybe want to share some of the book.
Yeah, for sure.
That would be great.
So I'll share a little taste from what I like to call the Home Alone scene, where it's about you know, 2/3 or so into the book, and Maggie has ended up at the middle of nowhere farmhouse of an ally of hers, basically, and she's been left there alone to recuperate from a bit of a battering that she's taken. She takes quite a few throughout both of these books. And she gets a phone call from her ally who's frantically on the way back, telling her that some very, very bad people have been sent to find her and get rid of her. And all she has is what's in the house. So I'll dive in there and I'll read a little bit, and then we'll see how we go. The kettle was boiled. She tapped it, checking the heat. She glanced out the window. Still nothing. She pulled the back door slightly ajar. A chill crept into the room. Maggie opened the kettle and placed it on top of the door, leaning slightly against the frame. She stepped back. The kettle stayed put, but it was precarious. She hurried to the front door. She had 3 serrated steak knives. Kneeling, she pressed the blades one by one against the floorboards until they all snapped free of the hilts. Then she stuck the jagged, broken bottom of the first blade between the floorboards, about a meter from the front door. It was a tight fit, but it worked. She planted the other 2 the same way, nearby, then stood and backed away. She turned off the hall light, and the house was plunged into darkness. She moved sideways into her room and crouched beside the bed. She found her money, now bundled into an envelope, and stuffed it into her pocket. She listened. She'd been waiting less than a minute when she heard the creak of the front porch. Her heart rate increased. She took the hammer from her belt. She moved just beside the door, pressing herself up against it. She heard the front door handle turn and open, slowly. Then the shoved open back door, followed by a thud, a clatter of metal on wood, and screams of stunned pain as boiling water soaked the man who had just come through. A yell from the front, heavy footsteps, and a gasp and a cry of pain, which got louder as he pulled himself forward and staggered past Maggie's door, a silhouette in the dark. Maggie moved through the doorway, saw his crumpling figure from behind, saw the back of his head, and brought the hammer down hard on it. A crack and he was down. She glimpsed flailing on the ground near the back door, but ignored it. She bolted straight through into Carlin's room as the first gunshot sounded. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that so sets the scene perfectly.
Yeah, it was my it was funny. It was like this scene that I so enjoyed writing, where, you know, she has to like set these makeshift traps around the house, and somebody read it and was like, "Wow, so you definitely grew up with Home Alone, didn't you?" And I was like, "Oh yes," but you know, I mean, I think, you know, we all know that like a big part of the writer's vocation is just like outright theft. So you know, that's what you do.
Oh, fabulous. Now, I need to get this out of the way first. Last time I saw, well, the only time I saw you in person, Gabe, you had a bit of a sash, a little bit of a pink sash on, and a bit of a tiara happening, maybe. I can't remember. Where were we?
We were at the Sydney Writers' Festival debutante ball up in Sydney, and we were all looking very fetching with our sashes, which they, you know, they beautifully gave us with debutante emblazoned across it. And yeah, I mean, it was in retrospect, it was kind of bittersweet because it was such a good night. You know, they invited us all up there, you know, authors who kind of had their big debut adult novels come out during 2020, but sort of lost out on being able to publicize properly because of, you know, the obvious reasons. And you know, it was this kind of like beautiful chance to like for all of us to kind of just get in a room and celebrate what we, you know, we had surely done plenty of celebrating around, but hadn't yet had a chance to really acknowledge this thing that had happened. And it was so good because I remember thinking at the time, like, man, you know, I'm meeting all of these awesome authors, like yourself included, and I'm like hanging out with all these cool literary types. I had such a great night. And I was like, this is what I missed with The Hunted, because, you know, I was locked down in Melbourne the whole time, you know, that book was coming out and doing promo for that. And I was thinking, you know, I'm so looking forward to this for The Inheritance. You know, I can't wait to do like more festivals and panel appearances and meet and mingle and do all of that cool stuff, as you know, as we all did. And then we're back into lockdown. And again, I think I maybe just have to like stop bringing out crime thriller books, because we seem to go back into lockdown like days after I release one. So, you know, maybe I have to like take a step back from that for the foreseeable future.
No, don't you dare.
And I've got quite a few questions coming through from people watching, which is really great. So Mary wonders if you write as you go, or do you plan before?
Such a great question, because, you know, I'm so fascinated by, you know, the plotter pantser binary of writers. Like, are you one of those writers who kind of flies by the seat of your pants and makes stuff as you go along, or are you one of those writers who meticulously plots everything out? And I think I'd be really interested to know where you sit, Karina, on this spectrum as well, because I think most of us tend to be like somewhere in the middle. And I'm probably almost exactly in the middle, in that I like to have kind of very simple bullet points of where I'm going, and sort of, you know, I guess an understanding of the goalposts I'm moving towards, but I never plan too rigidly, because I tend to find that some of the very best moments in writing come in the discovery. You know, it's where you come up with a character who you didn't think was going to be anything other than functional, and then suddenly you realize that they're the most compelling thing in the story. That's what happened with Maggie in The Hunted. You know, I didn't write that book intending for her to be the main character. And you can almost see, if you read it, she starts out very kind of small in the background. And I think you could probably almost chart my growing fascination with this girl as she starts to take over the book. And a similar thing happened in The Inheritance with the supporting character of Jack Carlin, you know, where he didn't take over the book as much as Maggie did, because I don't think Maggie would have been too happy with that. But it was another thing where this was a character who was only supposed to appear in a couple of scenes, was only supposed to have a very functional role, and ended up becoming, like, I think one of the most sort of the most like almost moving parts of the story. Like, I think in some ways the relationship between him and Maggie becomes like the heart of the story. And so I love having the opportunity for that. And I guess I have this fear that if you plan too meticulously, you don't allow yourself those moments of discovery. Like, I've known writers who, you know, plan out every single beat and it works for them. But for me, I guess I would hate to rob myself of the chance to have a character or a story take me off in some completely unexpected direction, because I was being too rigid with my planning. I mean, where do you sit on that, Karina?
I'm definitely a pantser, but I like to know the end. That's really all I want to know. I want to know the end, and I'll just wing the rest of it.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, isn't it? Like, because yeah, I mean, I like to know those main beats, but I also do find if I don't know the ending, I'm in serious trouble. Like, if I don't have some idea of like what I'm working towards at the end, and I've tried it, the first draft of The Inheritance, I had no idea how it ended, and it, you know, it came back to bite me. Like, I got to the point where I was flying blind, and I kept like I started to just make stuff up, which, you know, you shouldn't be doing. It should feel natural, like it's kind of flowing, and that wasn't happening. And it took, you know, a lot of like hair pulling and heads banging against walls and kind of pain and angry rambling phone calls to arrive at a place where, you know, I found what worked. But I think not having that like goal I was working towards really scuppered it. So it's so interesting to hear that, like, you know, you can pants as long as you've got the ending, you know?
Yeah, I can anyway. But you're a really accomplished writer, Gabe. You're a screenwriter and a playwright. I mean, screenwriting is quite contained, isn't it? You must have a lot of discipline within screenwriting, I'd imagine.
Look, I would say that, I mean, look, I've obviously worked in a few different fields. Like, you know, I've written books, I've written quite a few plays, and my training is for the screen. Like, you know, my only sort of, you know, official training as a writer was in screenwriting. But weirdly, given that is where I studied, screenwriting is what comes the least naturally to me out of all of these forms. And, you know, it's funny because a lot of people read The Hunt and they said, oh, it's, you know, it's so filmic and it feels like it's meant to be a movie. And I get that, because I think in my head, I saw it as a movie to begin with. But writing the screenplay version of The Hunted, which I've been doing in the ongoing film production, was really difficult. And that form of writing is so difficult because exactly what you said, it's the constraints. And you have to think about, you can't pop into a character's head and articulate their feelings or their thoughts on what's going on. You have to somehow find a way to, to do that phrase that every writer hates but has to adhere to, the show don't tell thing. But doing that, bearing in mind constantly, I can only write what can be seen on screen. I can't allude to complex or nuanced emotions. I have to just like somehow hint through a character smiling, or the way that a character picks something up and turns it over, what's going through their head and what they're feeling. And I find that really difficult. And the other thing is, because I was very used to writing theatre, and theatre, particularly independent theatre where you don't have a lot of money, ultimately the art of theatre is in characters having conversations. It's in dialogue, it's in characters talking and trying to make that compelling drama in its own right. So when I studied screenwriting, instinctively I veered towards that kind of writing. I veered towards very dialogue heavy, very chatty kind of chamber pieces, because that's what I was used to doing. And studying screenwriting really taught me that no, you have to think visually. You have to think in terms of images. You have to think in terms of the memorable images that people will take home with them when the movie's finished. And I think all of these disciplines have kind of come together at this point in my career to help me in different ways. I think theatre taught me how to write dialogue, novels taught me how to make the characters a bit richer and a bit more complex, and film has taught me how to think visually at every turn to make sure that it never feels static and it always feels like there are images being conjured that are compelling in their own right. But, that doesn't come easily to me. And so I'm really glad for having studied that. But yes, screenwriting is something that I find particularly difficult.
Oh, that's really interesting. And you're also a short story writer. You also write YA and even a little bit of erotic fiction, I believe.
Oh, man.
Tell us all. It's just between us. It's all right. You're with friends.
I mean, it's just that thing that, like, I know that people can't help but bring it up, and I mean, it's funny. It's I do try to I think I did an interview with The Guardian, and I told them, and I was like, well, the cat's out of the bag now. But yeah, I used to do a lot of ghostwriting back in my early kind of nascent writing career days, and that meant writing erotic fiction at the time for not very much money. And, luckily a lot of this was not published under my name. Nobody will ever know that I wrote it. And, I'm happy to be open about it as long as nobody ever reads it. I think is probably the sweet spot where I sit here.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Mary wonders if there's anyone in your life who inspired your writing.
Oh, man. I mean, so many, you steal from, a steal probably makes it sound worse than it is, but you take from everyone around you, and you take from the people who interest you. I mean, you look at Jack Kerouac, what he wrote in On the Road, where he talks about all his life being driven to the mad ones, the ones who are mad. I can't remember the quote verbatim, but how he was always drawn to those mad, strange, compelling people and wanting to write about them. And, I'm not saying that is my approach, but I've always been absolutely fascinated by the people around me and fascinated by so many people, like growing up and even now. But in terms of like direct influences, because I think almost everybody I've ever met and known has influenced my work in some way or another, I think the person who I probably have to come back to the most is John Marsden. When I was a kid, he was my absolute hero and my idol. I adored his books so much. And when I was 12, I was lucky enough to go to one of the writing camps that he used to run. And it was just so seminal, like spending that time with him and just seeing how this guy who I had always seen as, I guess the way you do see authors when you're a kid, right? As this kind of like, far off ideal, like the gods of these stories that compel you so thoroughly. And then to meet him and just say, and, and to realize in the best way possible, oh, he's just a guy. He's a really wise, intelligent, empathetic, kind man who, I felt like I really connected with, and I learned a lot from him. And there was like, I wouldn't go as far as to say like there was a mentor thing going there, but it was like, people say never meet your heroes, but then I think there's something even more magical in meeting your heroes and realizing that your hero is still all the amazing things that you thought they were, but they're also just a human being at the same time you can have a conversation with, and you can talk to, and you can joke with. And that just makes it even more special, because it kind of almost, I guess, maybe in some implicit way makes you wonder, or makes you start to believe that maybe you, being just a person, can reach the level that this other once upon a time just a person has reached. And that was incredibly inspiring. I mean, John's writing itself was always huge for me, but John the man has been, a mass inspiration for me in so many ways.
And I've got a few people wondering what's next for you.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of things coming up next. I've got a couple of film projects I'm working on. The Hunted movie is still ongoing, but that's, without being able to talk too specifically about where that's at, I can say that it is now closer than it's ever been to happening. And there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on now that the world's kind of coming out of lockdown. So I think there's going to be some really big announcements on that front very, very soon. But on the more literary side of things, so I've just had an Audible original come out, The Consequence, which is sort of a prequel to The Inheritance. So the character I mentioned before of Jack Carlin, the rogue ex-cop who Maggie works with in The Inheritance, it's sort of an episode from his backstory that I sort of wrote simultaneous to doing The Inheritance. And it kind of ended up being a really cool inadvertent character building exercise for that character. I mean, the best way to kind of get to know a supporting character is to apparently write a 30,000 word novella about them at the same time as you're doing the book. So that's out now, and I'm doing a second one with Audible now as well. So I've got a second Audible original, which is going to be a little bit more in the hunted type territory. It's kind of more like Outback again, but less horror, more psychological thriller, basically about a middle-aged self-help aficionado who's kind of this like goofy, hapless guy who's kind of having a bit of a midlife crisis, and he's traveling through middle of nowhere Australia, and he impulsively decides to pick up a hitchhiker because he's like, oh, it's all about like, having these crazy new experiences that I've never had before. And he picks up a hitchhiker, and that hitchhiker has a secret that slowly comes out. And so most of it is set in this car as you kind of slowly realize the situation this guy has put himself into, and it escalates into some pretty wild places. So that, I think, comes out early next year, and I'm having an absolute blast writing that. So that, like The Consequence, that'll be available exclusively through Audible. And then I've got a couple of other novels. So I've got another YA book coming out next year, which is very different to The True Color of Little White Lie, my YA book that came out this year, or Boone Shepherd, my earlier YA stuff. It's more like I guess a dark YA thriller would be the best way to put it. So it's the kind of thing that I think thriller readers could get a real kick out of, even though it is, a young adult novel. But I'm really, really excited for that, because that was a project that in different forms I'd been working on for about 12 years. And always kind of, that one project you always have that you're always like, I just have to get it right. And this finally is that project that, like, after years upon years of reworking, redrafting and everything, it's coming out next year. It doesn't have a title just yet, but that'll be announced really soon. But that's something I'm massively excited for. And I'm working on another adult novel at the moment as well, which is another thriller. It won't be about Maggie. It'll be a different book, but Maggie will reappear down the line as well.
Well, you certainly sound like you've got a lot going on.
I just, I've got to say, like, in the past, people have kind of asked me, like, how do you juggle so many things? And I'm like, by not having a social life. And during the lockdown, that was fantastic, because I had I had an excuse to just like, be a workaholic. But now that we're coming out of lockdown, it's like, well, I guess I have to go back to, being the sad hermit writer locked in his room, like frantically tapping away at the keys. But, it's good. I'm really excited about the new stuff coming up, and yeah, just hope people like it, I guess.
And I'm interested in knowing, like you said, a couple of your books are audio only. What makes a publisher decide that that's what they want to do? Do you know?
Well, it's a tricky one, because Audible have recently started commissioning quite a few of these originals. So, I think authors like Carolyn Overington did one, Jack Heath did one, JP Pomea did one.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of them kind of, you know, happening now. And it was just kind of something where my agent asked me if I'd like to, you know, pitch for one. And I was in the middle of doing The Inheritance, and I thought, you know, I really like this Jack Carlin character. I'd kind of like to give him his own chance to have his own story to tell. So I pitched it, and they accepted it. And then I guess knowing that it was going to be audio only, and knowing that it was going to be an exclusive for that medium, kind of changed the way that I wrote it. Like I sort of treated it more like it was almost an extended monologue as opposed to a novel. Like whereas, you know, with The Hunt and The Inheritance, they're both written in the third person. They're both, you know, like designed to feel as if you're following Maggie on these, you know, terrible situations that she finds herself in. Whereas I tried to write the consequence as if you were sitting in a pub with Jack Carlin and he pulled up a chair across from you and you were having a couple of beers and he was just telling you this story. So it's written in first person, and Greg Kane, who narrates it, he did an amazing job, like giving Jack this really distinct kind of way of speaking. And so I think it has that kind of like campfire story, like yarn at the pub feel to it, or I hope it does anyway. And so yeah, I don't know how it would work as a prose story because it was so explicitly written for the audio medium, because I knew that's what it was going to be. But it is really fascinating at the moment just to see what's coming out of Audible now with these Audible originals, and seeing how authors are finding ways to take advantage of that format, and how I guess the lines between different types of storytelling are being blurred. You know, the lines between podcasts, between radio play, between theatre, between novels are all kind of being blurred together in these Audible originals in a way that I find really interesting.
Yeah,
it's
no,
all
that is
storytelling,
interesting.
isn't it? Whether it's verbal or written. And I'm an absolute audio book fan now. And I was reading some stats the other day where audiobooks are outselling ebooks. You know, they're just taking off. It's such an easy way to consume a book. You know, you can do it while you're driving or doing the dishes or whatever. You know, you don't have to be a person with the luxury of time to be able to sit and do nothing else except read. So really accessible.
You know, it's funny because I think it was Vicky Petreitis, another author who I know. She was the first person who told me that on certain apps you can do it where you have the ebook and the audiobook both on your phone, and they respectively record where you get up to. So you can like sit there and like read it on your iPad or whatever, and then you can like lie in bed and listen to it, or listen to it as you walk. And she was saying that that's like the quickest way to get through a book, because you know you can hear it, listen to it, and you kind of are always reading consequently. And I think that, you know, in the past, because my dad always used to read a lot of audiobooks when we were growing up, and he used to drive a lot back and forth between Sydney and Canberra and stuff. And so he'd always listen to them in the car. And that's how I got used to listening to audiobooks when I was younger. But nowadays, you know, I think it's with the advent of podcasts and everything, I think people are a lot more willing to just like, you know, listen to it as they're exercising or as they're walking or whatever, and just kind of have it plugged in and have it, you know, happening. So I think it's awesome the way that audiobooks have blown up so much, and they're just so accessible now as well, which is really cool.
And it also really helps with the, you know, the falling literacy rates around the world. You know, audiobooks cover that off perfectly.
Absolutely. You know, if it's like anything that can, I don't know, I mean, I guess like any author, you know, we're all just kind of desperate to get our stories out there in whatever medium it takes. And so, you know, you kind of can't begrudge anything that allows your story to reach new readers or listeners, as it were, you know?
Yeah.
And Mary wonders what you like to read, and wondering if maybe you've got anything you've read lately that you could recommend to us.
So I'm predominantly a thriller reader, but the reality is that I'll read anything if it's, you know, if it really like captures me, and if it really, or if it comes really highly recommended, I'll give a shot to anything. You know, I mean, I really enjoyed, I'm just trying to think of a couple of different examples of things I read recently. I think that the thing that really stood out to me that I've been kind of obsessing over in the last year is Only Killers and Thieves by Paul Howarth. So that was similar to what we were talking about before with reading The Hunt and the Inheritance out of order. He's an English writer who has written a couple of books set in colonial Australia and they're kind of historical fiction, but they're kind of thrillers as well. And I was sent the second one before it was published, Dust Off the Bones, by his publisher to potentially give a quote for. And, I got it and I read it and I knew nothing about it. And I was so enraptured by it and I was so caught up in it that I was like, who is this? Who is this guy? What is this story? And then about halfway through, I realized it was a sequel. And it worked completely on its own merits, but I definitely got to the end and was like, God, I wish I read the first one first. But then I went back and I read the first one. And Paul was really clever in how he wrote them both, because even though they very much continue on from each other, and together they very much tell like what I guess you'd call like an outback thriller epic saga about these two brothers and their trials and tribulations over several years. There are big twists in the first one that the second one doesn't spoil. So you read the second one and it kind of recaps everything you need to know about the first one, but that doesn't actually ruin the experience of reading the first one, because there's a lot that you don't know when you do read it, like the fates of certain characters and everything. So you can actually read them either way. And, I still enjoyed reading them. I still enjoyed reading them out of order, but I would definitely recommend pick up the first one, Only Killers and Thieves by Paul Howarth. And it's unlike anything else I've ever read. Like, just such vivid prose, such compelling characters, and it's dark, it's very full on, but it's just so compelling that you won't be able to put it down.
That sounds brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. We must put that in the notes, Jackie.
Yeah. And Belinda said, you mentioned that you have YA books. She's wondering what your favourite books were to read when you were a teenager.
Oh, don't get me started. I'm sorry. Let's not go down this road, because there are just so many. I mean, Tomorrow When the War Began, I mentioned before, John Marsden was massive for me. I was very much the Harry Potter generation, so lining up at the stores and doing all of that and dressing up and those things. I've just finished a start to finish reread of Animorphs, which was huge in the 90s when I was a kid, and I never finished the series when I was younger. It's been out of print for 20 years, but I kind of went down a bit of a nostalgia rabbit hole earlier in the year, and I remembered how much I loved those books and how awesome they were. And then I just spent way too much time and money like tracking down every single book on eBay and buying them all and getting the whole set. And then I read the whole set and have bored everyone I know to tears going on about it, because I think I became more obsessed with it now as a 30-year-old man than I was as an 8-year-old kid, which, is closer to the target audience for it. But so, that was huge as well. But I also, I think like a lot of teenagers, I read up quite a bit as well. So I read, I was reading like The Exorcist, Silence of the Lambs, that kind of thing when I was about 13 or 14. And that probably is what created my love of horror and of thrillers. When I read Red Dragon when I was 13, like that just completely changed my understanding of what stories could do and could be. So I've got like a sort of beautiful hardcover edition of Red Dragon that was my birthday present to myself last year up there, and Silence of the Lambs, because they were just absolutely seminal to me. But I was probably too young to read them when I read them, and I think when people read The Hunted and they find out I was reading Red Dragon at 13, they go, oh yeah, that explains a lot. But in the grand scheme of things, I can't say that I regret that choice in the slightest.
I think I was the same. I read really dark very early in my life. But give us a tour of your mantelpiece, Gabe, because you've got some really nice mementos up there, haven't you?
So I was saying to these guys before we started recording that this is just my collection of nerd stuff. So prior to the lockdown, I just kind of had it all here on the mantelpiece, but it's ended up becoming
angle your screen down a bit, Gabe.
Oh, there you go. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah,
great.
It ends up becoming quite a kind of cool backdrop to like all the Zoom events I've had to do. So you can see there's the car from Ashes to Ashes and Life on Mars. There's Bilbo and Gollum, The Hobbit. There's the shark from Jaws. That's a painting of a couple of manatees there. There's a lightsaber behind there. Yeah, it's great. It was a present from some friends. Jaws is my all-time favorite movie, so it was a present from some friends a few years ago. It's amazing. There's a Dalek there from Doctor Who. There's a TARDIS. Some dinosaurs around the TARDIS. Bits and pieces. There's Mads Mikkelsen's Hannibal Lecter.
Wow.
Yep. Little figurine that I actually won that on Twitter from the showrunner of the TV show. So that was
that is so cool.
It's a very, very prized possession of mine. Yeah. And yeah, sort of my mantelpiece of like, you know, the books I most value, like my expensive Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs editions, and a signed copy of Bruce Springsteen's autobiography.
Oh,
So
wow.
so yeah, that's my nerd stuff.
Oh my goodness. And you've got one more nerd thing. I think it's a nerd thing. Maybe it's like a super special thing. Tell us about the Emmys.
Oh my god, yeah. Yeah, so that was yeah, in 2015 I won the Sir Peter Ustinov Television Scriptwriting Award, and it was probably the first I want to say the first bit of like serious validation I ever got as a writer, because, you know, I'd never like won anything or been shortlisted for anything or, you know, any of that stuff. I was just like that deluded kid who was like, I can make a go of this. And that was, you know, how I approached for a really long time. And it was right after I'd finished my master's in screenwriting, and I'd entered that script that I'd written for the master's in the Peter Ustinov Award. And I didn't think I'd, you know, get so much as a look in, but then I was shortlisted, then I won. And that was beyond anything I ever could have expected. And so, yeah, I basically got swept away on this whirlwind weekend in New York. And so it's not the primetime Emmys, which is what people think of. It's the international Emmys, which is like for non-English language speaking shows, or that's not quite true, for basically any show that isn't predominantly funded in America. Yeah. So, you know, a lot of like amazing TV shows from all around the world, and like a lot of different really, really cool shows and really cool people there.
European shows, everything.
Yeah. It was amazing. And it was just like, you know, I remember being like, God, how old was I? I would have been 23 or 24 at the time. And I was fresh out of uni. I was flat broke. I was working retail. And here's me turning up, like walking the red carpet, surrounded by these celebrities, and like only having enough money in my bank account to eat at McDonald's every day. And, you know, like, and I remember like ducking out of this cocktail party, and I still vividly remember ducking out of this cocktail party hosted by HBO as like part of the Emmys festival, and like running down to the nearest Macca's, which was in Times Square, to like get my 6 nugget meal, because I figured I should probably eat something before I started drinking cocktails with, you know, famous producers from all around the world. And then, I mean, there's this one instance, and this is, a lot of people who know me know this story, but maybe the viewers don't. I've mentioned a few things, but my most embarrassing memory of the Emmys was the day before the gala itself. There was this big lunch at the Hilton, and you know, basically all the nominees and everyone were like invited to go along there. And the guest of honor was Julian Fellowes, who is the creator of Downton Abbey, the writer and creator of Downton Abbey, which at the time was like really, you know, in its heyday. And I remember like sitting there, and Julian Fellowes is kind of exactly what you imagine the guy who writes Downton Abbey to be. He's kind of very like portly, proper British man who has this like very kind of deep, like very well enunciated way of speaking, and he's very proper. But he got up and he gave this speech, and it was the most like warm, self-deprecating, funny, and ultimately moving story about all the difficulties of being a writer, you know, and about how he never thought he would make it. And it took him until he was 50 for Gosford Park to get picked up, which was like his first big break. And, you know, coming at this point where I'd really just been through a long stretch of like desperately trying to like be noticed at all, and I'd finally got what seemed like a break at the time. It just really hit me, you know, like, and I think any writer relates to the stories of, you know, like the years upon years of rejection and everything he has to put up with, and hearing that was the case for someone like him. I mean, it kind of comes back to what I was saying about John Marsden before, you know, the realization that people on that level, you know, they are just humans, and they grapple with the same insecurities and fears and doubts and everything as the rest of us. And I kind of resolved to say something to Julian Fellowes if I got the chance, you know, and I wasn't a Downton Abbey fan or anything, but I was like, it just meant so much to me what he'd said that I was like, I have to take the chance if I see him to just tell him that. And so anyway, that night, the gala itself happens, and, you know, I was sitting there and I watched the awards, and I was completely in a daze that any of this was real and happening to me. And at the end of it, as everyone was kind of dispersing after the event, I was waiting around for the people who I knew who were busy, you know, looking after more important people than me. And I didn't really know anyone. And so I went over to the bar and I was like, I'll just get a beer. And at that point in the night, they were like, no, there's no more beer. It's just spirits and aperitifs at this point. What do you want? And I was not a spirit drinker. So I was just kind of like, I guess I'll have a scotch. That's what guys drink, right? Like, that's, you know, I'll get a scotch. The thing was, they were trying to get rid of all their scotch. So the guy gave me a pint glass and topped it up right to the brim with scotch, a pint glass of scotch. And he gave it to me. He was like, there you go. I'm trying to get rid of it. So you just have that. And I'm sitting there with my pint glass of scotch. And I'm like, well, I don't want to die. So I'm going to have to find somewhere to put this. And as I'm looking around to like find, a surface to leave it on, I look over and I see Julian Fellows. And he's surrounded by like a posse of important looking people. And I'm like, this is my chance. So I kind of hurry over and they're all around him, at this point. And he's sort of in the middle, like, being surrounded by praise and attention. And I'm like trying to kind of, work my way into the circle and, become a part of it in a way that's, very natural. And finally, I sort of get through the circle and Julian Fellows has his back to me. And I'm like, Mr. So I just poke him in the back. And Julian Fellows like turns around to look at me. And he's not a tall man, but my God, in that moment, he was a giant, like towering over me. And I'm sitting there like little 23-year-old me from Australia, like, with his Macca's lunch and his cheap suit. And I'm just like, Miss Fellows, hi. Hi. So look, I saw your speech today, and I just want to say, I don't watch Downton Abbey, but I saw your speech, and I absently, that's not a word. Sorry. No, look, I guess I just want to say that it really meant a lot to me, and I thought it was really good, and I was so glad that you said it. And as I'm fumbling through all of my words and running words together, and just the picture of nerves. And I'm seeing Julian Fellows' just absolutely bewildered expression. I see his eyes move from babbling me to the pint glass of scotch in my hand. And I'm standing there just like, I won an award. And Julian Fellows just looks at me and goes, yes, well, very good. And then he just turns around and goes back to his conversation. And I'm standing there just like, and I just sort of, make myself very scarce after that. So that's probably the thing that I remember most clearly from the Emmys. That's not going to leave me in a hurry, that experience.
That's one of the best fanboy stories ever. It's just great.
Yeah, well, anyway, that happens.
And I've got a question from Tamazon. She said she loved The Haunted and The Inheritance is on her to-be-read list, but she wonders what you had as your first idea for The Haunted.
The Hunted, yeah.
Yeah, not The Haunted.
Yes, such a good question. Such a good question, because it was, I don't know if I've ever told anyone this. It was a dream.
Oh, really?
And in the dream, I was Don Draper from Mad Men, which in retrospect seems like wishful thinking. But I was Don Draper from Mad Men, and I was stuck in middle of nowhere Australia being hunted by a bunch of hicks with rifles. Now, apart from the fact that I was probably watching too much Mad Men at the time, I don't know, I don't know what my subconscious was trying to tell me there. But despite how absurd it was, there was just something about that always stuck with me. And I think, every small Australian country town has the other little town up the road that you have all the stories about how you just shouldn't go there. And, I was always fascinated by the ideas of those bad places, the places that and most of those towns in reality are just fine. They're just lovely little towns. But, the idea of places that bad things happen and the stories kind of filter away and you don't really know what's going on there and you don't really want to find out. But I guess I was always just like so interested in that idea of the bad places of Australia hidden away in the middle of nowhere, but obviously not brave enough to actually do the trip to find out about them. And, over the years, there were just a few different things that kind of, aligned. Like the dream was the start of it. And I just never got over that image of like, the hicks with guns in the bush. But then when a few years later, there was a really good friend of mine who was brave enough to do the road trip, and he came back just with some really unsettling stories about like people he'd met out on the road, about this family who he stayed with in this middle of nowhere town, who just like, he could never tell if they were, everything they said, he could never tell if it was like a joke designed to throw him off or if they genuinely were threatening him or what was going on. And he was just kind of stuck there. And partway through the night, they told him this story about this town up the road that you just weren't ever to go to, because if you went there, this guy would come out and he would greet you and he would set you up in a house and then you just weren't allowed to leave. And they told my friend this story. And in retrospect, they were probably just trying to mess with the city boy. But that always stuck with me as well. And so bit by bit, all of these like stories kind of blended together. And originally I wrote it as a short story or as a novella, really. So it was just the flashback material where it's Maggie and Simon going to the town. That was all it was. And then just bit by bit, it kind of grew from there, and all of these different ideas and thoughts. And then, like a lot of things about like growing up in a small town, and a lot of, if you're a remotely artsy person growing up in the country, there are challenges that come with that. And, a lot of, I guess, what I saw firsthand growing up from like particularly, young guys trying to be tough, and then they take jokes too far and everything. There's always been a lot of that around, and I guess all of those influences just bit by bit kind of came together to create this story. But yeah, it started with Don Draper being chased by a bunch of hicks with guns.
And I'm interested to know if you have a favorite snack or drink while you're writing.
So I'm a notorious pub writer. There's a great little bar down the road from me, Rose Delita's in Camberwell, and that's basically my office, or, in non-lockdown times is my office. So I'm so excited to be allowed to go back there. But yeah, I love just like sitting and having a couple of beers while I write, a couple of like nice stouts or something. I don't really snack when I write for whatever reason. I know a lot of writers do that religiously, but I've never been much of one for that, I guess. But yeah, no, if I'm in a nice pub and it's good atmosphere and they're playing Bruce Springsteen, then and I'm writing and I'm having a beer, like what could be better than that,
And I'm interested to know, have you done any acting yourself?
And so yeah, funny story that yeah, I wanted to be an actor when I was a kid, not a writer, and I actually got into Caulfield Grammar down here on a drama scholarship, with the assumption being that I was going to, pursue acting as my future. And it only took about 1 year at that school, because Caulfield is a very big drama school and has like a very focused drama program. And, there are a lot of talented people who've come out of that school. And it only took me about a year there to realize that I wasn't a very good actor, that I didn't have the same kind of abilities as like a lot of my peers, I guess. And I'd always obviously been really interested in literature, and I'd always kind of tried to write stories in the background, but had never been very good at it. But I guess, sometime around the time I was in year 12, I guess I just found that the writing overtook the acting for me, that I found that was what I was focusing on more. I was more passionate about it. And then, about a year or so after that, because I still acted on and off, like mainly in community theatre stuff, until I was about 21 or 22 maybe. And I always enjoyed it. And, if an opportunity came up, like in a community theatre play or something, I would be the first to jump up and, and do it for the fun of it. But as a career now, I think I've long since moved past it. And I think when I hit the moment of realizing that acting wasn't going to be my future, and when that realization didn't hurt at all, that was when I was like, okay, you know what, like, time to put this away and focus on the thing that I really care about, which was writing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I loved acting. I just haven't been on stage in a very long time. So I would be terribly rusty if I tried now, I think.
And I've got a good comment from Kim, who I think you know, Kim.
Oh no, here we go.
And she said,
hi, Mum.
She said, I always thought he was a great actor.
Oh, thanks, Mum. Somebody has to be in the fan club of one for my acting abilities. So.
And where do you see your career now, Gabe? Like, can you be a full-time writer in Australia? I mean, it's hard, but how do you see that developing?
Look, I'm a full-time writer, but I'm not a full-time author, I think is the way I would put it. In that, I write full-time, but that's, I try to supplement it from like a few different angles. So obviously, like, screenwriting, doing writers' rooms, doing that kind of thing. So, I consider myself a full-time writer, but, it's not just writing books that I do. So, because I think, making a career just doing that is exceedingly difficult in this country. So, look, I mean, in terms of where I see my career and my future going, I guess I haven't thought that much about it. And that probably sounds like a cop-out, but it's not, because I never thought seriously thought, I wanted it obviously, and I went for it, but I never seriously thought I could be where I am now, you know?
Mhm.
And that was never a serious considered reality for me, or a possible reality for me. It was the dream, but I was kind of like, if I can get to that point, then that would be more than enough. And I think, I never wanted to be Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or like some kind of, famous household name author. I always just kind of, I guess I always thought, if I could be at a place where I could sustain myself with my writing, and I could be telling stories that I was passionate about for readers who were enjoying them, that was always going to be enough, And I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but right now I'm living that. And that is the best thing I ever could have asked for in my whole life. And I am so grateful that somehow, through some bizarre set of circumstances, I've arrived there. I'm grateful for it every single day. So no, really, I don't think that much about the future, because I think right now, for the first time in my professional life, I'm just enjoying the present way too much.
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
that's so great
great
to hear.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's been awesome talking to you. And hopefully we might have a chance to talk to you again.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's been great. And thanks to also everyone else who joined in. We had some really great questions. And thanks, Karina, to joining me.
My pleasure.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
See you, everyone. Thanks for coming along.